The world knows her as a symbol of discipline, a self-made black billionaire who built her empire on structure, restraint, and control. Her story is taught as proof that suffering creates strength. What the world does not know is that the same discipline that made her powerful destroyed something she never counted. Two boys grew up under that discipline. They followed the rules. They endured the pressure, and only one of them was allowed to succeed. The other disappeared quietly, efficiently, and legally. This is the story of how discipline chooses who matters. Evelyn Carter was introduced to the world as a woman who had mastered control long before she mastered wealth. Her public image was built on precision, restraint, and an unwavering sense of order. She was known as a self-made black billionaire whose rise was attributed not to fortune or favoritism, but to discipline executed without compromise. Every profile written about her highlighted the same traits: self-control, focus, and an almost severe commitment to structure. She did not appear softened by success. If anything, success seemed to sharpen her. In business magazines, Evelyn was framed as a symbol of American possibility. Her story was positioned as evidence that discipline could overcome any structural disadvantage. Leadership conferences invited her to speak not just about success, but about suffering as a prerequisite for it. Audiences listened closely as she explained that comfort weakens ambition and that order is the foundation of greatness. Her certainty carried weight. She spoke as someone who had survived chaos and emerged refined, someone whose authority came from having endured more than most. Evelyn believed deeply that suffering built strength. In her worldview, hardship was not something to be softened, but something to be endured fully. She treated pain as a teacher and viewed emotional restraint as a form of intelligence. Order, to her, was not merely organization but moral discipline. She believed that greatness required submission to structure, and that those who resisted structure were resisting their own potential. This belief shaped her decisions, her investments, and the way she evaluated people. What remained absent from her public narrative was the past that shaped these convictions. Evelyn rarely spoke about her formative years, and when she did, she kept the details abstract. She referenced struggle without describing it, discipline without explaining how it was learned. The silence was interpreted as professionalism, even humility. Admirers assumed that the details did not matter because the outcome was so clear. Her success became the justification for her silence. Yet beneath the polished narrative lay something unresolved. Her story carried an emotional tension that never fully surfaced, a sense that her success had been built on something unnamed. Discipline was the word she used to hold the story together. It explained everything while revealing nothing. By calling her methods discipline, she transformed experience into principle and consequence into virtue. The word protected her from scrutiny because it sounded inherently righteous. Evelyn's presence was powerful but distant. She moved through elite spaces with confidence, yet without warmth. Applause followed her, but connection rarely did. She was respected more than she was known. This emotional distance reinforced her authority. It suggested that she had transcended the need for reflection, that she had already done the hard work and moved beyond it. Few questioned whether something had been left behind in that process. Her success was undeniable, but it lacked softness. It was measured, controlled, and insulated. Power surrounded her, yet it did not invite intimacy. She spoke about resilience but did not linger on vulnerability. Her narrative allowed no room for doubt, no space for moral complexity. Discipline functioned as both explanation and shield, a way to simplify a complicated past into a marketable philosophy. The world praised her discipline because it was comforting. It suggested that suffering was fair if it produced winners. It implied that pain could be justified by outcomes, that cruelty could be reframed as character building if success followed. Evelyn Carter became the embodiment of that belief. Her wealth and influence gave the idea credibility. If her methods worked for her, many assumed they must be right. What the narrative did not acknowledge was that discipline does not feel the same from every position of power. The word changes meaning depending on who has the authority to define it. Evelyn's version of discipline was chosen, controlled, and later monetized. It was a language she could wield, but the origins of that language were never examined publicly. The story moved forward without looking back. Her past remained quiet, unchallenged, and unnamed. The silence was not accidental. It was structural. By refusing to tell the full story, Evelyn preserved the clarity of her success. Reflection might have complicated the message, and complication threatened certainty. Discipline allowed her to maintain both power and narrative control. The world praised her discipline, but discipline is often a word people use when they cannot bear to say what really happened. What she called discipline had once been experienced very differently by two boys who never had the power to rename it. Marcus Reed and Caleb Johnson grew up in a part of the city where choices were rare and consequences were constant. Their neighborhood existed in a state of quiet emergency, where survival shaped daily behavior more than hope ever could. They were children, but childhood did not protect them. It trained them. From an early age, they learned to move carefully, to listen more than they spoke, and to accept that stability was not something promised, only borrowed. Housing insecurity defined their early years. Apartments changed without warning, sometimes because rent rose, sometimes because doors simply closed. Familiar walls disappeared overnight, replaced by new rooms that felt temporary from the moment they entered. Possessions were kept light because permanence was never guaranteed. The idea of home became fluid, less a place than a pattern of constant adjustment. Stability was something adults talked about, not something the boys experienced. Their schools reflected the same uncertainty. Underfunded classrooms struggled to provide consistency, let alone inspiration. Teachers rotated frequently, resources were scarce, and expectations shifted without explanation. Learning felt secondary to control. Marcus and Caleb noticed that effort did not always result in reward, and confusion was often mistaken for disobedience. The system functioned, but only barely, teaching them to lower expectations without ever saying so directly. Food scarcity threaded through their days in subtle ways. Meals were planned carefully, portions measured, hunger normalized. They learned when to ask and when not to. Appetite became something to manage privately, another instinct to suppress. The boys understood that need made adults uncomfortable, so they learned to hide it. Survival required emotional discipline long before anyone called it that. Their lives depended heavily on external authority figures. Adults controlled access to shelter, food, and education, often through systems that demanded compliance in return. Marcus and Caleb learned quickly that survival meant cooperation. Resistance carried risks they could not afford. Obedience was not a virtue, it was a strategy. They followed rules not because they believed in them, but because rules controlled access to necessities. Opportunity, when it appeared, never came freely. It arrived wrapped in conditions, framed as generosity but structured as leverage. Programs promised improvement but demanded conformity. Gratitude was expected regardless of cost. The boys sensed that help could be withdrawn as easily as it was offered. Choice existed only in theory. In practice, participation was mandatory if they wanted to remain afloat. Emotionally, Marcus and Caleb carried quiet endurance. Fear was ever present but rarely named. Confusion lingered beneath the surface, unanswered because questions felt dangerous. They learned to read tone, anticipate moods, and adjust behavior accordingly. Silence became a form of protection. Expression invited attention, and attention invited risk. Endurance was safer. Childhood for them was not delayed, it was denied. Play was brief and cautious, joy interrupted by responsibility. The future was not imagined expansively, only managed carefully. Dreams felt indulgent in an environment that demanded practicality. They measured time by survival rather than growth, by what could be endured rather than what could be hoped for. Marcus leaned into structure instinctively, finding comfort in predictability. Caleb complied as well, but with an internal tension he did not yet understand. Both were adapting, shaped by circumstances that left little room for softness. They did not know ambition yet. They knew rules, routines, and consequences. Their lives were about to intersect with a woman who believed hardship was a gift. Evelyn Carter entered Marcus Reed and Caleb Johnson's lives not as a person but as a presence. Her influence arrived through institutions that carried her name and her philosophy, through programs described as opportunities designed to correct the trajectory of boys deemed at risk. Administrators spoke of her with admiration, presenting her involvement as a rare stroke of fortune. To the world watching from the outside, her intervention looked like rescue. To the boys, it felt like the beginning of something they did not yet know how to name. The program that connected them to Evelyn was introduced as mentorship and sponsorship combined, a structured pathway meant to replace instability with order. It promised resources, consistency, and access to a future that had previously felt unreachable. Marcus and Caleb were told they had been selected because of potential, because someone important believed they could become more. The message was clear even if the terms were not. This was a chance that could not be refused. Evelyn's philosophy shaped every layer of the program. Strict routines governed daily life, leaving little space for spontaneity or rest. Time was regulated, behavior monitored, progress measured continuously. Emotional distance was not only encouraged but modeled. Care was expressed through correction rather than reassurance. Weakness, as defined by hesitation or emotional expression, was treated as a flaw to be eliminated. The system valued control above comfort, results above reflection. In public perception, Evelyn was positioned as a savior. Media coverage praised her willingness to invest in children others had overlooked. Her reputation as a self-made billionaire lent authority to her methods. She was celebrated for demanding excellence where others expected failure. The narrative framed her approach as tough love, necessary and effective. Few questioned whether love was present at all. The power imbalance was immediate. Evelyn had choice, Marcus and Caleb had need. Participation was technically voluntary, but refusal meant returning to instability without support. The boys understood this instinctively. Survival narrowed their options. Consent existed only on paper. In practice, compliance was the price of entry. Gratitude was assumed, not negotiated. The first moments where rules replaced compassion were subtle. Expectations were explained calmly, consequences outlined clearly. When confusion surfaced, it was redirected rather than addressed. Questions slowed the process and were quietly discouraged. The boys learned quickly that clarity was less important than obedience. The system did not pause to understand them. It expected them to adapt. Discipline began to function less like guidance and more like ownership. Their time was no longer theirs. Their behavior was evaluated constantly. Progress was defined externally, measured against standards they did not help create. Support was conditional, dependent on continuous compliance. The safety they were promised existed only as long as they performed correctly. Marcus adapted quickly, recognizing patterns and aligning himself with expectations. He saw discipline as a path to stability, a way to earn safety through precision. Caleb complied as well, but with a growing sense of unease. He felt the shift from care to control more acutely, though he could not yet articulate it. Both boys learned that the rules mattered more than their reasons. Evelyn herself remained distant, her philosophy enforced through others trained to emulate her detachment. Her name justified decisions, her standards ended debates. She became less a person than a principle, an authority that could not be questioned. The boys did not interact with her directly, yet her influence shaped every aspect of their lives. What looked like rescue from the outside felt like ownership from within. The program did not adapt to the boys adapted to the program. Their emotional responses were regulated, their needs reframed as obstacles. Compassion was implied but rarely practiced. Discipline was presented as care, but it demanded surrender rather than trust. As days turned into weeks, the structure tightened. What had been introduced as temporary guidance began to feel permanent. Flexibility disappeared, expectations intensified. The boys realized that discipline was not a phase to outgrow, but a framework designed to shape them indefinitely. The rules would soon stop feeling temporary. As the program settled into routine, structure stopped feeling like guidance and began to feel like consequence. Rules multiplied, narrowing behavior into approved patterns that left little room for error or recovery. Schedules tightened until there was no margin for rest, only performance. What had once been described as support now functioned as enforcement. Deviations were noted, tracked, and corrected without discussion. The system did not ask why something went wrong. It recorded that it did. Physical and emotional exhaustion became normalized, even praised. Long days were framed as preparation for a demanding world, fatigue as evidence of commitment. Marcus and Caleb learned that tiredness was not a signal to slow down, but a sign they were being shaped correctly. The language surrounding exhaustion stripped it of its warning function. Feeling drained meant they were progressing. Relief was treated as indulgence, rest as distraction. Endurance became the baseline expectation. Gratitude was demanded, not earned. The boys were reminded often of how fortunate they were to be included, how many others would have wanted their place. Thankfulness was expected regardless of the cost. It did not matter whether the structure helped or harmed them. Appreciation was mandatory. Gratitude functioned as a closing statement, a way to end conversations before discomfort could surface. To question the system was to appear ungrateful, and ungratefulness carried consequences. Fear was steadily reframed as motivation. Anxiety about failure was encouraged, described as the pressure that kept standards high. The boys were told that discomfort sharpened focus and that unease prevented complacency. Over time, fear lost its meaning as a warning and became a constant condition. Calm felt suspicious, even dangerous. They learned to operate under stress because stress never receded. The absence of fear was interpreted as a lack of seriousness. Silence emerged as the most reliable survival strategy. Marcus noticed quickly that questions slowed progress and explanations invited scrutiny. He learned to offer only what was required, to keep his inner reactions contained. Caleb learned the same lesson but for different reasons. He sensed that expression would not lead to understanding, only correction. Silence protected them from attention. Attention brought evaluation, and evaluation carried risk. Both boys began to internalize blame. When expectations felt overwhelming, they assumed the failure was personal. The system presented itself as neutral and fair, so discomfort was interpreted as deficiency. Marcus blamed himself for moments of strain, believing he needed more discipline. Caleb blamed himself for feeling out of place, assuming the problem was his inability to adapt fully. Neither considered that the structure itself might be harmful. The framework did not allow for that interpretation. Success, as defined by the system, had a specific shape. It was orderly, quiet, and measurable. It rewarded those who could suppress doubt and present control. Marcus fit that shape increasingly well. His compliance was efficient, his performance consistent. He learned to anticipate expectations before they were stated, aligning himself seamlessly with the rules. Each approval reinforced the belief that endurance equaled worth. Caleb's experience diverged subtly. He met the same standards, but the effort cost him more each day. His silence was not efficiency, but withdrawal. He learned to disappear within the structure, to comply without engaging. The system did not notice the difference. It measured output, not internal cost. As long as standards were met, the process was considered successful. Pain was not accidental within this environment. It was embedded, intentional, framed as instructional. The curriculum taught endurance before understanding and obedience before agency. Compassion was replaced by consistency, care by correction. The boys adapted because adaptation was required. The system rewarded adaptation and ignored its consequences. Marcus began to change in ways that were praised but not examined. His emotional range narrowed, not out of numbness but out of focus. He believed minimizing friction was the key to advancement. The cost of that belief remained invisible even to him. The system registered improvement and moved on. One boy began to change in ways no one noticed. Marcus Reed learned to move through the system with precision. He listened closely, adjusted quickly, and delivered exactly what was asked of him. Over time, this compliance translated into visible success. Evaluations improved, responsibilities increased, and his name began to carry weight within the program. From the outside, his progress appeared undeniable. He was cited as proof that discipline worked, that structure could transform instability into achievement. The system recognized him as strong because he never disrupted its rhythm. That recognition came with a quiet trade. Marcus began to measure himself through approval rather than understanding. The traits that earned praise were the same traits that required him to suppress uncertainty, doubt, and discomfort. He learned to keep his reactions contained, his questions minimal. Emotional restraint became a habit, then a reflex. The more he succeeded, the less room he felt he had to examine what success was costing him. Strength, as defined here, left little space for reflection. Caleb Johnson followed the same rules but with a different internal posture. Outwardly, he remained obedient. He met expectations, respected schedules, and avoided conflict. Internally, however, resistance took root. He noticed how discipline demanded silence and how silence erased context. He felt the pressure to conform not just in behavior but in belief. Unlike Marcus, he could not fully internalize the system's values. His resistance did not surface as defiance, it settled into quiet withdrawal. The system rewarded suppression and punished honesty with consistency. When Marcus withheld emotion, it was interpreted as maturity. When Caleb hesitated or showed uncertainty, it was flagged as a lack of commitment. The difference was subtle but consequential. Marcus received praise for composure. Caleb received correction for the same silence when it was accompanied by distance. Honesty carried risk. Transparency invited scrutiny. The lesson was clear even when it was unspoken. Praise and punishment operated along predictable lines. Marcus's alignment with expectations earned him opportunities and protection. His success reinforced the belief that the system was fair. Caleb's internal resistance, though invisible in performance metrics, manifested in moments the system interpreted as attitude. He was monitored more closely, corrected more often, trusted less. The contrast shaped their self-perception. Marcus learned that strength meant disappearing into the role. Caleb learned that survival required guarding his inner life carefully. Invisible psychological fractures began to form in both of them. Marcus experienced a narrowing of self, a gradual shift from internal motivation to external validation. He began to associate worth with output, identity with performance. The pressure to maintain consistency grew heavier with each success. Failure felt less like a setback and more like a threat to his place within the system. The cost of being strong was constant vigilance. Caleb's fractures took a different form. Living with internal resistance required continuous self-monitoring. He learned to separate what he felt from what he showed, creating distance as a form of protection. The system did not measure this distance, so it went unnoticed. Yet it shaped his experience profoundly. Compliance kept him afloat, but it did not provide belonging. His obedience was strategic, not affirming. The idea that success and damage could coexist was never acknowledged by those in control. Marcus's achievements were celebrated without examining the erosion beneath them. Caleb's endurance was ignored because it did not produce visible advancement. The system validated outcomes and dismissed costs. Strength was defined by silence, by the absence of disruption. Anything that complicated the narrative was treated as weakness. Marcus began to sense the weight of his success. Each new opportunity came with increased scrutiny and narrower margins for error. The expectations that once felt like guidance now felt like constraints. He responded by tightening control further, suppressing anything that might jeopardize his standing. The system rewarded this adjustment, reinforcing the cycle. Strength was affirmed as long as it remained quiet. Caleb felt the opposite pressure. His outward obedience masked a growing sense of alienation. He recognized that honesty would not be met with understanding, only with correction. Silence became his default, not because he agreed with the system, but because he understood its limits. The cost of being strong for him was isolation without recognition. Neither boy was encouraged to question what strength required. The environment prioritized outcomes over well-being, efficiency over understanding. Marcus's surface success masked dependence on external approval. Caleb's outward obedience concealed internal strain. Both were adapting, but adaptation did not equal health. The system thrived on these dynamics. It produced success stories that justified its methods and contained resistance quietly. The distinction between thriving and surviving blurred. Marcus believed he was thriving because he was advancing. Caleb knew he was surviving because he felt the constant need to protect himself internally. The system did not differentiate between the two as long as performance remained intact. Strength, as rewarded here, demanded sacrifice. It required suppression, silence, and the steady erosion of inner life. Marcus paid that price willingly, believing it was temporary. Caleb paid it reluctantly, aware that something essential was being taken. Both believed they had little choice. The balance between reward and cost was shifting. What had once been enough would soon be insufficient. The system would soon demand a sacrifice. The moment that changed everything arrived without spectacle. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, no visible collapse. It came instead through a process designed to appear neutral, announced in language that felt final before it was fully understood. A review, an assessment, a recalibration of resources. By the time Marcus Reed and Caleb Johnson grasped the implications, the decision had already passed through layers of approval that could not be reached or reversed. The evaluation had been framed as routine, another checkpoint in a system built on measurement. Standards were refined, expectations narrowed, priorities clarified. The criteria no longer focused solely on performance but on alignment. It was no longer enough to succeed, one had to succeed in the correct way. Discipline, once described as a tool, had become the standard by which worth was determined. The shift was subtle, but its consequences were absolute. Marcus emerged from the process elevated. His record reflected consistency, composure, and measurable outcomes. He had learned to operate without friction, to anticipate expectations and meet them cleanly. The system recognized him as an ideal investment. Resources were redirected toward his advancement, framed as a reward for discipline well executed. The language emphasized fairness and merit, presenting the outcome as an inevitable result of objective standards. Caleb's outcome was delivered through the same neutral tone. Despite meeting performance benchmarks, his internal resistance had left traces that could not be quantified but were nonetheless recorded. Moments of hesitation, a lack of visible enthusiasm, a distance that did not disrupt output but complicated narrative. These were labeled as misalignment. The system concluded that continued investment was inefficient. Support was withdrawn, not as punishment but as strategy. Evelyn Carter framed the decision as necessary discipline. In official explanations, she emphasized focus, sustainability, and the responsible allocation of resources. She described the outcome as difficult but essential, a demonstration of integrity rather than exclusion. Discipline, in this framing, required choosing who would move forward and who would not. Sentiment was treated as interference. Efficiency was presented as ethics. Language did the work of protection. Words like recalibration, redirection, and standards softened the reality of removal. The decision was abstracted into process, distancing it from consequence. Power protected itself by translating human cost into administrative logic. Caleb's loss was not described as abandonment but as an unfortunate mismatch. Marcus's gain was not described as advantage but as earned progression. The language made the split appear natural. For Marcus, the moment brought confirmation and unease. Advancement came with access and security, but it also clarified the conditions of belonging. He understood now that the system's favor was contingent, maintained only through continued alignment. The elevation carried an unspoken warning. The same discipline that lifted him could just as easily withdraw its support. Silence became not just a habit but a requirement. For Caleb, the decision crystallized a truth he had sensed but never fully named. Participation had never meant equality. Compliance had never guaranteed care. The support he had relied on vanished without acknowledgement of endurance or effort. The system did not explain itself beyond procedure. He realized that he had been evaluated not as a person, but as a variable. His value had always been provisional. This was the moment both boys understood they were never equal participants. The opportunity had been conditional from the beginning, designed to filter rather than foster. Discipline was not merely a standard, it was a gatekeeping mechanism. Those who could internalize it fully were advanced. Those who could not were discarded, regardless of cost. The system rewarded surrender, not survival. Cruelty was redefined as policy. It no longer appeared as an unintended side effect, but as a feature justified by outcomes. The decision demonstrated that harm could be rendered acceptable when framed as necessity. Compassion was excluded not by accident but by design. The process functioned precisely as intended, producing clarity at the expense of care. Evelyn remained insulated from the immediate aftermath. Her distance allowed her to maintain conviction. She saw outcomes, not disruption. The language that framed the decision shielded her from its consequences. The narrative of discipline remained intact, reinforced by Marcus's advancement and untroubled by Caleb's disappearance. The split set trajectories that would not converge again. Marcus moved forward carrying both opportunity and constraint. Caleb moved outward into instability, carrying clarity without support. The system moved on, confident in its logic. The moment passed quietly, recorded and archived. This was the day discipline chose who mattered. The fallout would follow them for decades. Marcus Reed's life began to move upward in ways that looked impressive from every angle except his own. Each advancement placed him in cleaner rooms, quieter spaces, and more controlled environments. His resume filled with markers of achievement that signaled progress to anyone reading it. He became the kind of outcome the system liked to display, a visible confirmation that discipline produced results. Yet with every step forward, something receded inside him. The sense of arrival never came. Achievement stacked neatly, but meaning did not. Success brought isolation rather than relief. Marcus learned that advancement reduced margin for error and narrowed emotional range. The higher he rose, the less room there was to be uncertain, reflective, or human. Relationships became functional, defined by usefulness rather than connection. He was respected, not known. The habits that had once protected him now kept others at a distance. Winning did not feel like freedom. It felt like maintenance. Caleb Johnson's life moved in the opposite direction, though the descent was quieter than anyone expected. After support was withdrawn, he encountered institutional neglect in its most ordinary form. Programs closed without notice. Applications went unanswered. Guidance arrived late or not at all. There was no single collapse, only accumulation. Each missed opportunity reinforced the sense that the system no longer saw him as worth tracking. Neglect functioned efficiently because it required no explanation. Where Marcus was elevated as evidence, Caleb became absence. His struggles were not dramatic enough to demand attention, not visible enough to disrupt narratives. Society interpreted the difference between them simply. Marcus was proof of merit. Caleb was framed as someone who could not keep up. The methods that produced both outcomes were rarely questioned. Results were treated as self-explanatory. Process disappeared behind conclusion. Marcus became increasingly aware of this imbalance. Praise landed heavily, carrying implications he did not ask for. He understood that his success existed alongside someone else's erasure. This awareness produced a quiet survivor's guilt he could not articulate. Gratitude was expected, not complication. Acknowledging the cost felt dangerous, even disloyal. He learned to carry the discomfort silently, folding it into the same discipline that had brought him this far. Caleb's resentment developed slowly, layered with fatigue rather than anger. He did not resent Marcus directly. He resented the story that explained their divergence without acknowledging the conditions that shaped it. He saw how easily society accepted outcomes as evidence of worth, how little curiosity it showed about what had been required or taken. His endurance went unnoticed because it did not produce visible success. The lack of recognition deepened his sense of invisibility. Marcus's success increasingly resembled isolation. The environments he occupied valued composure and certainty, not reflection. Vulnerability felt out of place, even risky. He learned to present confidence regardless of what he felt. The more he was held up as an example, the less space he had to question the system that elevated him. Silence became part of the role. His identity fused with performance, leaving little room to exist outside it. Caleb lived with a different isolation. His was shaped by instability and disregard. Institutions interacted with him sporadically, without continuity or commitment. He learned to rely on himself where possible, adjusting expectations downward to avoid disappointment. Resilience became necessary rather than celebrated. His life did not collapse, but it narrowed. Survival replaced progress as the primary objective. Society continued to validate Marcus's outcome without examining the methods behind it. His story circulated as inspiration, stripped of context and consequence. Caleb's absence from that story reinforced the illusion that the system worked. The disparity between them was framed as natural rather than constructed. This framing protected the system from accountability and allowed it to replicate the same dynamics elsewhere. Both men carried unresolved tension. Marcus sensed that his success rested on a foundation he had never fully examined. Caleb sensed that his struggles were part of a larger pattern that would never be acknowledged unless someone named it. Each lived with questions that followed them quietly, shaping decisions and relationships. Avoidance became harder to maintain. The distance between them was no longer just material. It was interpretive. They inhabited different explanations for the same history. Marcus wrestled with gratitude and guilt, unsure how to reconcile achievement with cost. Caleb wrestled with resignation and clarity, aware that his experience would likely remain unheard. Their paths continued forward, but the unresolved split traveled with them. Success did not deliver peace. Failure did not extinguish endurance. Both were approaching moments where the narratives assigned to them would no longer hold. Both were approaching a reckoning they could not avoid. Evelyn Carter's rise to billionaire status unfolded with the same precision that defined her philosophy. Each step upward appeared calculated, justified, and reinforced by results. Her ventures expanded steadily, branching into sectors that valued efficiency, predictability, and control. Investors admired her clarity. Boards trusted her discipline. She became known not only for generating profit but for imposing order on chaotic systems. Her wealth grew as a direct extension of her worldview, confirming it at every stage. What began as a personal belief system evolved into a commercial product. Evelyn monetized discipline by translating it into frameworks, methodologies, and branded solutions. Her philosophy was packaged as a universal answer to dysfunction, marketed to institutions eager for control. Books outlined her principles. Conferences amplified her authority. Consulting models carried her language into corporate and civic spaces. Discomfort was reframed as growth. Strictness was sold as care. The market rewarded the simplicity of her message. As her influence expanded, so did her distance from the origins of her beliefs. Evelyn refused to revisit the past, not out of fear but out of dismissal. She considered reflection inefficient, a backward glance that slowed momentum. In her view, the past mattered only insofar as it produced the present. Once success was achieved, the process was validated. The question of cost felt irrelevant. Results, to her, closed the conversation. Wealth insulated her conscience in subtle but powerful ways. Surrounded by affirmation, Evelyn encountered few challenges to her narrative. Advisors and partners echoed her language, reinforcing the idea that success equaled correctness. Financial growth functioned as moral proof. The system she built rewarded alignment and filtered out dissent, creating an environment where doubt rarely surfaced. Those who benefited from her philosophy rose alongside her, further validating her certainty. Her belief that results justified everything hardened with time. She evaluated decisions through outcomes rather than impact. If a system produced efficiency, it was deemed ethical. If a program generated profit, it was deemed effective. Human cost was reframed as necessary friction, an unavoidable byproduct of progress. Evelyn did not see herself as harsh. She saw herself as realistic. Sentiment, in her calculus, interfered with clarity. Money made the story sound cleaner. It reduced complexity into numbers that could be displayed and celebrated. The messiness of individual experience was incompatible with the clarity demanded by markets. Evelyn's wealth allowed her to curate narratives that emphasized triumph while omitting fallout. The more successful she became, the more convincing the story sounded, even to herself. Wealth amplified her voice while muting contradiction. Publicly, Evelyn was celebrated as a model of transformation. Her rise was framed as inspiration, her discipline as universally applicable. Media profiles highlighted her achievements without examining the systems that enabled them. The absence of critical inquiry reinforced her belief that reflection was unnecessary. Success, repeated often enough, became its own justification. Privately, Evelyn maintained strict control over her environment. Her schedule left little room for unscripted encounters. Her inner circle consisted of those who shared her worldview or benefited from it. Dissent was rare and easily dismissed. Reflection, when it occurred, was strategic rather than moral. She assessed risk, not responsibility. The past remained closed, its relevance diminished by present achievement. Yet wealth cannot erase unresolved truths. It can obscure them, delay them, soften their edges, but it cannot remove them entirely. The language Evelyn used to protect her narrative also limited her understanding. By framing discipline as inherently virtuous, she avoided confronting the difference between choice and coercion. That distinction persisted outside her control, carried in experiences she did not track or measure. The systems Evelyn built continued to operate, producing outcomes that mirrored her beliefs. Some rose and were celebrated. Others disappeared quietly. The absence of those stories did not disrupt the narrative because it was not designed to include them. Wealth allowed her to maintain this selective visibility, controlling which outcomes were highlighted and which were ignored. The story Evelyn told herself remained coherent and complete. It explained her success without requiring revision. It justified her decisions without demanding accountability. But coherence is not the same as truth. By refusing to revisit the past, she left it unresolved. The distance created by wealth felt secure, reinforced by validation and control. Money had polished the narrative and amplified its reach. It had also created a vulnerability she did not recognize. The past, long dismissed as irrelevant, had not disappeared. It had only waited. Until the past resurfaced without permission, stories like this don't ask for attention, they ask for reflection. If this story stayed with you, it may stay with someone else who has lived through similar choices. Passing it along keeps these questions alive, and staying connected ensures we keep telling stories that don't rush past the truth. So here is the question this story leaves behind. If discipline creates success but leaves damage in its wake, is it still discipline, or is it just cruelty renamed by those who survived it? And if you were in their place, which version of the story would you have been allowed to tell?